The story of most presidents can be told without a mention of the second man on the ballot. However, George W. Bush's legacy cannot be retold without his vice president.
Dick Cheney unquestionably is the most powerful vice president in history. He changed the course of history in a way that no vice president has.
He was very firm, calm, cool, making decisions clearly.
Born in Lincoln, Nebraska, Dick Cheney was raised by a middle-class family in Casper, Wyoming. He was a high school football player, baseball player, and the senior class president. He enrolled in Yale, but quickly discovered that he was not accustomed to the environment. And at the age of 20, he had already failed out of Yale twice.
By the age of 22, he had been arrested 2 times for driving while intoxicated. Cheney knew he had to turn his life around. He re-enrolled to college at the University of Wyoming, and in 11 years, he became Richard Nixon's deputy chief of staff. By the age of 34, he was President Gerald Ford's chief of staff, the youngest one to date. Quickly rising through the ranks, he was nominated to be George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense.
Under Secretary Dick Cheney, the United States launched Operation Desert Storm, jump-starting the Persian Gulf War. Armed forces were sent in to force Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, a sovereign and oil-rich nation. However, Cheney and the president decided it would be best not to invade Iraq at the time, and troops who had fought in the war were brought home.
After Bush Sr. lost the election to Bill Clinton in 1992, Dick Cheney was out of a job. He chose to retire from politics and move on into the private sector. He became the chief executive and president of Halliburton, and by the time he left, they were the 22nd largest military contractor in the United States.
In 2000, George W. Bush asked his father's loyal aide to be his vice president. Although uninterested, Cheney offered to help him search for a viable candidate. After hundreds of hours of interviews, Cheney came to the conclusion that none of the senators, congressmen, and senior staffers were compatible with the person Bush was looking for. He realized he was the right man for the job and took Bush up on his initial offer. On September 11th of 2001, a band of Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners and redirected them towards major control centers of the country. The Pentagon was hit, both towers of the World Trade Center collapsed, and Washington, D.C. just avoided the attack. The Bush administration responded quickly and strongly by declaring a war against terrorism and the axis of evil, composed of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. These countries were believed to be the ones responsible for sponsoring terrorism. The administration called for an invasion of Iraq that would take Saddam Hussein from power and create a system of democracy in the country. The strongest advocate for these decisions? Dick Cheney.
Cheney is saying we've got to do it. The intelligence is there.
Bush is insecure as president. Cheney brilliantly exploits this.
Cheney points to Iraq's refusal to submit to weapons inspection as clear proof that Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction.
In Cheney's eyes, it was also necessary to create a system, which he did through the NSA, to spy on U.S. citizens in order to properly track terrorist activity. The program authorized warrantless tapping of international cell phone communication and allowed the NSA access to countless private emails. He felt that the executive branch's power trumped the judicial and legislative branches in a state of crisis, so he did not try to get the program passed through Congress or even an elected official. It was Dick Cheney's own attorney who authorized much of the spying that took place.
2 new people, important people, arrived at the Justice Department. One is Jack Goldsmith, who becomes the head of the Office of Legal Counsel. And then there's a new Deputy Attorney General, Jim Comey.
These 2 new arrivals quickly realized that this program was unconstitutional and against the law. Comey refused to sign off on the authorization and threatened to resign along with many more members of the Attorney General's office.
They just simply happened not to be adherents to the notion that the president need not obey federal law.
This gesture was the beginning of the end of this program, which was deemed unconstitutional in 2006 and truly collapsed in 2013, being replaced with prison.
The war in Iraq then began, officially starting on March 22, 2003. The war was going well, and much of the regime of Saddam Hussein had been taken out of power by 2004. Problems arose, however, on how to establish democracy and peace within the region. Although Cheney did not say it, he knew more than 10 years ago that this issue would come with an invasion of Iraq. Iraq had gone into a civil war by 2006, with rival factions of Sunni and Shia Muslims vying for power, and there was rising violence against U.S. troops. There were not nearly enough troops to create stability, and the Bush administration rejected calls from generals asking for more boots on the ground. This resulted in a never-ending war that is still being fought today.
Furthering the collapse of the administration, Scooter Libby, Cheney's chief of staff, was convicted of uncovering the identity of CIA officer Valerie Plame Wilson on June 5, 2007. Dick Cheney wanted Bush to use presidential power to pardon Libby, but Bush did not think that a pardon was right in the situation. After this incident, the relationship between Cheney and Bush fell apart. It had been a rough ride that included the worst terrorist attack on American soil and a subsequent brutal international war. But Dick Cheney still has no regrets.
When you talk about drawing the line, you don't consider a prolonged period of creating the sensation of drowning. You don't consider torture.
I don't. It is a wartime situation, and it does require tough programs and policies if you're going to be successful. And it was more important to be successful than it was to be loved. The ones who spend all their time trying to be loved by everybody probably aren't doing much. If you're not prepared to have critics and to be subject to criticism, then wrong line of work. If you want to be loved, go be a movie star.